Now, getting into the functional components of skeletal muscle. So, of course, in this class, we're going to concern ourselves with skeletal muscle. Of course, we have other types of muscle in our body, and cardiac muscle being a very important one of them, and our smooth muscle. But we are going to talk a lot in pathophysiology about cardiac pathology. And in this class, we're going to talk about healthy muscle. So we're going to talk about skeletal muscle. So a whole muscle consists of three main components surrounded by a particular type of connective tissue that supports its function. So we're sort of starting from the outside and working our way in. So the body of the muscle, the bulk of the muscle that we think of, so when we think of the biceps brachii, for example, the body of the muscle is the muscle belly, and it's composed of numerous fasciculi. So we'll talk about the fasciculus in a moment. The muscle belly is surrounded by connective tissue, which is called the epimysium. Surrounds the belly of the muscle to help the muscle hold its shape. So we talk about our connective tissue as being different things like ligaments, tendons, muscle, bone, and everything, but really the connective tissue that runs around and within and throughout muscle ends up being contiguous with tendons and contiguous with the periosteum. We just call them different things because they're different arrangements of connective tissue that have different functions, but they really are all connected, just at its base. So the epimysium is around the muscle belly, helping it to hold its shape. And we'll talk about individual muscle shapes in a few minutes. Drilling down one level, a fasciculus is a bundle of muscle fibers. So each fasciculus is surrounded also by connective tissue, the perimysium. It surrounds and supports an individual fasciculus, and it serves as a vehicle to support nerves and blood vessels. So I said that bone was very metabolically active tissue. Muscle is also very metabolically active tissue. We need blood. We need circulation. We need to bring nutrients in and oxygen in and take carbon dioxide and waste products out. So we need the blood vessels to do that. So we have tissues that maybe don't have as good a circulation, and those tissues don't have as good a healing, but muscles and bones heal well because they have good circulation. So the connective tissue within and around the muscle serves as a support to nerves and blood vessels as well. So let's drill down a little bit farther. So we said a fasciculus is a bundle of muscle fibers surrounded by the perimysium. The muscle fiber is actually an individual muscle cell with multiple nuclei. So that's where the different types of muscle start to differ, is where the nuclei are and how many they have and all that stuff. But a skeletal muscle fiber contains all the contractile elements within the muscle. And it's surrounded by endomysium. It's a dense collagen fibril network surrounding each muscle fiber and helping transfer contractile force to the tendon. So that endomysium is around each muscle fiber, and it goes out into the tendon, which goes out to the periosteum. It's all connected. Amazing, right? So the myofibril is each muscle fiber is combined a bunch of myofibrils. The myofibril contains the contractile proteins that are within each sarcomere. And so the sarcomere is the basic element of muscle contraction. It's the basic contractile unit of muscle fiber. Okay, so if we go from smallest to largest, or from inside out, we have the sarcomere. Lots of sarcomeres are lined up end to end to create the muscle fiber or the myofibril. The myofibrils are bundled together as muscle fibers, and they're surrounded by endomysium. The bundles of muscle fibers are fasciculi, and they're surrounded by perimysium. The bundles of fasciculi are the muscle belly, and they're surrounded by epimysium. So we've got layers and layers and layers of bundles of fibers surrounded by connective tissue. That's what makes up our muscles. And I think it's cool. I think it's cool that we can even get out of bed in the morning, but apparently it works. So down to the microscopic level, a sarcomere is the basic contractile unit of the muscle fiber. It's composed of several different proteins, but the main two that are involved in muscle contraction, and I know this isn't like stop the press news, you've heard this before, actin and myosin. Those are our main contractile proteins in muscle. So I'm sure you've heard of the sliding filament hypothesis. There are video animations all over YouTube and in the module for you to look at. But basically, the actin filament slides past the myosin filament, and it results in the contraction of an individual sarcomere. So we have all these sarcomeres lined up end to end. They contract, and the muscle contracts. It's amazing, right? Actin filaments sliding past those myosin filaments. Then they have to release and relax. So with contraction, there's also a reaction. So when the myosin filaments, you have to have cross bridges between the actin and the myosin in order for the muscle contraction to work. So there's cross-linking between the heads of the myosin, and they're always sort of depicted in these theoretical drawings as little golf clubs, almost like little head of a golf club, and the heads attached to the thinner actin filaments. So a myosin head binds an actin filament, and it flexes, producing a power stroke between the actin and myosin. So the actin filament slides past the myosin, generating the force and shortening the sarcomere. A simultaneous contraction of sarcomeres shortens the entire muscle. So that's the sliding filament theory. Of course, there's other things going on the molecular level, but we're just going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about the crossover between the actin and myosin and muscle excursion and the functional considerations about it. So I'm sure that you all know about the troponin and the tropomyosin and all that, and we are going to happily not talk about that right now, but just knowing that that sliding filament theory is the basis for all muscle contraction. So 3 factors determine the functional potential of a muscle. One of them is the cross-sectional area. So if you have a big fat muscle with a big fat cross-sectional area, it's going to be able to contract more. So think of your bulging biceps. And if you've been pumping that iron at the gym, you got good cross-sectional area and you can generate more force. The shape of the muscle is also very important, and the line of pull. So line of pull, that phrase should sound familiar to you from chapter 1. The line of pull of the muscle determines what action is going to happen when the muscle contracts. Okay, so those 3 things determine the functional potential of the muscle. So form follows function. The thickness of a muscle is an indirect measure of the contractile elements available to generate force. Because remember, we've got bundles of fibers. We've got bundles of myofibrils making up muscle fibers, bundles of muscle fibers making up fasciculi, bundles of fasciculi making up the muscle belly, and so we have a lot of contractile elements available to generate force. The larger a muscle's cross-sectional area, the greater its force potential. Makes sense, right? A person with larger muscles can usually generate larger muscular forces than a person with smaller muscles. So it's crazy how much sense that makes. So with more muscle force, you can produce more torque across the joints. That's the whole idea. So shape is one important indicator of a muscle's specific action. So a long strap-like muscle typically produces large ranges of motion. So think about the rectus femoris, which crosses the hip and the knee, and it does hip flexion and knee extension. So it produces a lot of movement. Thick, short muscles typically provide large forces. So think about the gluteus medius, which is a thick, short muscle, and it produces a lot of the motion that we need to stay balanced when we're walking on 2 feet. So most muscles are one of 4 basic shapes. Fusiform, which is fat in the middle and pointy on both ends, if you want to think of it that way. Triangular, which has a broad attachment site tapering down to a small insertion. So broad origin tapering down to a small insertion. Rhomboidal, which has a wide origin and a wide insertion. And pennate, which has a central tendon with muscle fibers going off from it like a feather. So that's what pennate means. It means it's like a feather. So fusiform muscles include ones such as the brachioradialis. The fibers run parallel to each other, and typically they're used to provide large ranges of motion. So brachioradialis, biceps, those are our fusiform muscles. The biceps brachii, that's our classic fusiform, if you want to think of it that way. Triangular muscles have expansive proximal attachments, expansive origins converging to a small distal attachment. So they provide a stabilized base for generating force. The gluteus medius is a great example. The deltoid is another great example of a triangular muscle. Expansive proximal attachment tapering to a converging on a small distal attachment, generating force. Rhomboidal muscles have expansive proximal and distal attachments. So they're shaped like large rhomboids, which are offset squares, and they're suited to stabilize a joint, like a large rhomboid muscle like the gluteus maximus to stabilize a large joint like the hip. And its large forces depend on its cross-sectional area. So if you've been doing your deadlifts and you've got a good cross-sectional area, then you can really stabilize a large joint there. Gluteus maximus is our classic rhomboidal muscle. Another rhomboidal muscle, strangely enough, are the rhomboids for scapular retraction. So a lot of times they're thin, they don't have a big cross-sectional area, but they're doing a different sort of stabilization. Pennate muscles resemble the shape of a feather. When you look at the muscle fiber, so the direction of muscle fiber is going to tell us a lot about what the muscle is going to do. So in a pennate muscle, the muscles approach the central tendon at an oblique angle. So large force potential, but limited excursion. So there are some subclassifications of pennate muscles, unipennate, bipennate, or multipennate, depending on the number of fiber sets attached to the central tendon. So when we look at individual muscles, we'll look at that and we'll see which are which. So a classic unipennate muscle is the rectus femoris. So large force potential, but limited excursion.